Hope everybody's doing well today. This is Dr. Winkler again. This is for History, Modern Civilizations, 151G, and we're moving on with the lectures right now. Last time we got to the point where we were talking about the Renaissance. And I did make a statement last time when I first mentioned the Renaissance that in reality it does kind of lead to the modern world. Well, it does in the sense that we are moving in a direction toward the modern world. And of course, everything that happens moving forward influences that which is in the future. However, there are some issues we need to let me say it right. There are some issues we need to address in understanding what the role of the Renaissance is in advancing, shall we say, civilization and history. Is it a big advance? Is it a big change from the Middle Ages? I'm going to argue that it is really not. It does not create the modern world. You see right here in your study guide? Hopefully you've all pulled that up and you found it on Canvas. Here's your study guide. We're still on page 1. Does the Renaissance create the modern world? No, it doesn't. There are many, many differences. Some of the important issues that we often assume that are part and parcel of the modern world, some of our great advances, shall we say, in the 20th century, are really not present during the Renaissance. Does not create the modern world. See what I have right there? No, there are many differences. Can we say one of the great advances in human history is peace rather than a state of war? Well, we can probably say that. It does not bring peace. The Renaissance, oh my goodness, it's a terrible time. The Renaissance, as I've already mentioned, actually started in Italy, largely in the 1300s, the 14th century. And this is a period of a tremendous amount of warfare. Small states in Italy are fighting each other. France invades in 1495. We have all kinds of very, very difficult problems, and many nations are involved in fighting. So this is not a time frame of peace. It's a time frame of war, unfortunately. Does it bring freedom to the individual? Something that you and I take for granted, some things that we enjoy. No, it really doesn't do this. It's not really aimed at producing freedom for the individual. It's also not aimed at creating democracy, where people in the society have the opportunity to express themselves, particularly in government. Does it bring cultural advances? Yes. Okay. That's something a little bit misleading right here. It is a cultural movement. But some of the hallmarks we usually think about in the modern world is our technology, our technological advances. The fact that I'm even talking to you right now on a device is a good example of technology. We have some clever people. I'll talk about Leonardo da Vinci in just a little while, who is very much interested in technology. On the other hand, do we actually see technology created in the Renaissance that has a long impact? Unfortunately, we do not. In fact, a lot of people have very clever ideas that unfortunately go virtually nowhere. Are there social advances? Social mobility, people being able to move up? No, that's not true either. Now, having said largely what the Renaissance was not, let's take a look at what it was. Usually when I meet in a class like this, I will ask you brilliant students the simple question: what is the Renaissance? Very clever people, your people are brilliant. It's a French word, as you well know. And I'll ask, and several people will raise their hand and say, well, it is a rebirth. I say, absolutely correct. It is rebirth. Can we say a rebirth of what? And that gets people thinking a little bit more. And when I say rebirth of what, they'll say rebirth of antiquity, Greece and Rome. And I'll say, yes, that's true. But what parts of Greece and Rome? Is the Renaissance setting up slavery again? Is the Renaissance setting up the gladiatorial contests in arenas? Is it setting up chariot races? All this is very, very big part of the Roman Empire. And people say, well, no, it isn't. It doesn't do that. Well, what does it do? And let's see if I can get this so you can see a little bit better. What the Renaissance is an artistic and literary movement. Okay, going back to it is a cultural movement. I'm repeating myself. Remember, this is somewhat misleading. Okay, artistic and literary movement. The art and letters, plastic arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, literature, essays, fiction. This is all very much part of that. Now, in saying that this is a rebirth, the Renaissance thinkers and artists have a tendency to look back upon ancient Rome and ancient Greece and say, look what they were doing. And let's see if we can do the same kind of things that they were doing. Some of these issues, during the Middle Ages, we have more than one major art form. We have the Romanesque, for example. We also have the Gothic. I'm a big fan of the Gothic. I love the Gothic. Well, but there's a change. While the Gothic does have a tendency to have sculpture, it is very much within, shall we say, within the level of architecture. Most of the sculpture you see in the Gothic are figures that are in cathedrals. They're stylized to a certain extent. They tend to have the human figure is elongated because it kind of looks better with the architecture. If you have people with pleats in their skirts, for example, going way down, those kind of things. In the Renaissance, we do have a tendency to see what we call freestanding sculpture. Not part of architecture, but representation of the person standing by himself or by herself. So you stand out, freestanding. Can we say that the sculpture in the Renaissance has a tendency to be more representative of the human form, not stylized, not part of the architecture, but in reality, it look a lot more like people and in proper proportions. No doubt about that at all. Okay, that's something that they got from looking back at the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans were doing that. Perspective in art, usually in Gothic art, representing the human form. A lot of these are religiously oriented. Mary, the Holy Virgin, the Mother of God, and sometimes the Christ child. And when they are presented in art, we do have a tendency to them to look relatively flat. And in the Renaissance, going back to Roman art forms again, we do have a concept of depth. People look, shall we say, more realistic. And we get two kinds of perspective in Renaissance art. We have lineal perspective. The farther away it is, the smaller it appears. We have aerial perspective. The farther away it is, because of the interference of the air, it has a tendency to be less clear. Now, being from Utah, since we rarely have any moisture in the air, we don't relate to this nearly as well as people do in Europe. Every place we're talking about in Europe has a lot more rainfall than Utah does. So we get some mist, and that has a tendency, moisture in the air, that has a tendency to give us a aerial perspective as you go back. Can we say this is quite beautiful? Yes, we can. In the Gothic art, architecture, you do have a tendency to see what we call, let's see if I can pull something up for you here. We do have a tendency to see the pointed arch. Now, I think this is beautiful, but this is really outside the scope of our course. You see that we do have here the lines going up, and when you come over and you see the arch comes to a point, this is the Gothic arch. We also have a tendency to see a lot of stained glass. Okay, let's show you the Duomo in Florence. The Duomo in Florence is a dome. Okay. And you go, well, okay, the Romans were using domes. So there's a throwback to this kind of architecture. Okay. So this is quite different. Let's take a brief look at, well, let me say one other thing. There is a tendency for us to say that the Renaissance starts in Italy. Well, it did start in Italy. I shouldn't call it a tendency. And you'd say, well, why Italy? Well, there's several factors. One is trade, one is social values. People have money, and the church is there, and the church has a lot of money, and the church pays artists to do artwork for church purposes, like within churches and cathedrals. Another factor is there's a lot of Roman ruins around. Even though Rome was winked out at least 1,000 years before, in reality, not everything was destroyed in Rome. So you could actually go out and look at Roman ruins in places like Rome itself. Look around saying, oh goodness, this is quite interesting. And this is quite beautiful, and we could do the same kinds of thing. So there's a major reason why the Renaissance starts in Rome. Well, okay, in Italy. Now, literary movements. The Romans are writing differently than the people in the Middle Ages. There are themes that we don't usually see expressed in the Middle Ages. Now, there's church themes all over, but we are using themes about war that the Romans used. Now, let's go back to the idea here of Petrarch. Petrarch was a 14th century Italian writer, a very brilliant man. And some people say, at least as a literary movement, Petrarch really got the Renaissance going. And what does he do? Well, he looks at the Latin that's being spoken, and well written, I should say, at this time frame. And he says it's inferior. You see, what had happened to Latin as a spoken language, Spain, Italy, France, Romania, among others, are examples. These Latin-based languages had evolved to a point where they're no longer Latin. But the church is still using Latin. It uses Latin in its liturgy. It uses Latin when it's reading scriptures. It reads the Vulgate, which is a Latin version of the Bible. And Petrarch looks at this and says, the Latin is not good. We need to go back to the really good stuff, back to the Romans. So he wrote a book in Latin called Africa. It's about Scipio Africanus, and he was fighting Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Well, the Latin is considered to be very good, but even the Latin experts, the classicists who know Latin very well, they don't really read this. It's not read very much. The idea of going back to using Latin and the purity of Latin is actually a misfire, because one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance is not writing in Latin. One of the hallmarks of the Renaissance is actually writing in the vernacular. If you're in England, you write in English. Shakespeare writes in English. If you are in Italy, you write in Italian. So, but we can throw back to certain themes. I already mentioned Shakespeare. Let's just talk about him a little bit. As you are familiar with him, some of his plays deal with, shall we say, ancient Rome. One that I'm quite familiar with is Julius Caesar. I don't know if they're still doing this or not, but when I was a senior in high school, we studied Julius Caesar. And we even memorized some of the lines from it. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Roman themes, okay, classical themes, which is a hallmark of the Renaissance. Okay, let's step back now and take a look at some of the important artists. I have right here, for your viewing pleasure, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, I'm not a good art historian, though I enjoy it very much, but the art historians tend to refer to people by their first names. If you were in an art history class, for example, the professor lady would get up and say, we're talking about Leonardo. And you go, who's Leonardo? Well, first name. His name's Leonardo da Vinci. Everybody knows that. But the art historians have a tendency to refer to people by their first names. So if your professor's saying Leonardo, it's Leonardo da Vinci. Well, can we look at him as a person that's making great contributions? No doubt about it at all. Leonardo, even today, is considered to be one of the greatest technicians of drawing. This guy is so incredibly good at representing the form, either in ink or in sketchings, that he's considered among just like 2 or 3 other men that are extremely good at this. Well, his, as you can see, a lot of his work was done before 1500. However, the High Renaissance, which we usually assume is between 1500 and 1550, we do have a tendency to see that he is still working after 1500. And let's take a look at a few of his works, and so we can have a lot of fun praising them. The Mona Lisa, perhaps the most famous painting in the world. It is actually housed in the Louvre, perhaps the most famous art museum in the world. And it is often considered to be an example of excellence in portraiture and in drawing. Now, look at her. I think this maybe the coloration here would be a little more true. We were talking about linear perspective. There are materials, there's a hill, there's some, I guess these are rocks behind it here. And as you see, these in the foreground are a little bit clearer. These in the background, shall we say, are not as clear. This is aerial perspective. Does it appear that we have a few objects off to one side, objects to another side? As you go back, we are seeing a different kind of perspective. We're seeing linear perspective. Does she look like a stylized, shall we say, flat figure? No, she doesn't. She's got shading around her eyes, around her chin. Leonardo was one of your great perfectionists. This man had to do everything absolutely perfect. The trouble with perfectionists is they do not have a great body of work. We have, what, 10 paintings of his that we believe he actually did himself. For a lengthy career, this is not high productivity. In fact, it's not much at all. We have stories, for example, of when he was painting the Mona Lisa, and she's sitting there, and you can see a very nice pose. And by Italian standards, very attractive young lady. And at times he would come, he would look at her and look at the painting, look at her and look at the painting. And some days maybe he didn't make any marks at all. Some days he would set this up perfectly, get his brush out, and make a very small mark. So he had to do things in a perfect way. If we had a close-up, I've been told that he went so far as to paint her individual eyelashes individually, the hair in her eyebrows individually. He did these kind of things, and we end up with this literally fantastic representation. Another one of his very important works is the last, okay, get your fingers right, Last Supper, Leonardo, okay? And let's see. I'd like to get a big one. That might not be easy to do. Okay. There are a lot of you can see representations here. There was a problem in this fresco. You see, usually when people paint in frescoes, they do have a tendency to take wet plaster, and it might be a square foot, it might be a little bit more than that, and you put it on wet. That's the amount you have to paint that day. As the cement is wet, it can absorb the colors in your brush. And when it dries, those colors are going to be well preserved. But see, you have to do a certain amount of work every day. Leonardo does not want to do this. He's too much of a perfectionist. It all has to be done very, very slowly. So rather than using plaster to paint on, he experiments with a different kind of paint. I believe it was waxed based. He believes that if he uses waxed based paints, it will adhere to the surface highly successfully. And then he can come back and do a little bit every day. The problem with this is he was mistaken. Over time, little bits of this, little flakes, have fallen off. Over the years, the Italians have gotten artists there to try to do restoration. When little flicks have fallen off, they try to find them and stick them back on. Can we say, therefore, the original is not in an awfully good state of preservation? Interestingly enough, this is not directly on the floor, it's up a little bit. There's a small amount of scaffolding, which he had to get on in order to paint. And he was such a perfectionist, he's doing so many other things, that he only wanted to make a mark like once a day, if at all. Well, we have an account of a young boy. He was a young boy at the time. Monasteries, and it's in a monastery in the city of Milan in Italy. Monasteries did have a tendency to take in orphans, kind of take care of kids. And sometimes there were school kids as well. They would come in and get some instruction in basic Latin. So it's not uncommon to have young boys around at this time. Of course, you know what boys are like. You know, you're having a great time. You know, I can remember when I was a kid, you got to climb over things, you got to jump off of things. It's a lot of fun, and you get more coordination, learn how to do things that way. It's very nice indeed. However, the kids are playing here. Now they're not dumb enough to think that they're going to mess with this guy's paint, but they're very smart in another respect. They have a lookout. Okay, you don't want to get in trouble if somebody's coming. So the guys are playing around, and then they have a lookout, and then they see Leonardo coming. Leonardo was a very strong man, very powerful man. He's left-handed. And anyway, the boys go, "Oh, he's coming!" Scatter. They scatter, run, hide, and get in other places. And then they kind of watch to see if he's still there, so they can come out again. Well, they would see him there. He'd come there, and he would stand in front of the painting. Sometimes he'd come a little bit closer, a little bit farther away, and look at it and go, let's see, can I do something else here? And then he'd pull out his brush, walk up to it, make his mark, and then leave. The kids, okay, come on out. He's not coming back again today. You say this, therefore this work took a long time. When Leonardo took commissions to do art, a lot of times the people who paid him money, it's usually the church, pay him money and say, would you get this thing done? We got a lot of money in this. He said, I got other things to do. He had such a wide variety of interests. It was hard for him to focus on just one project. Well, this is a brilliant piece of work. I wish we get a little closer, nonetheless. Probably not. You can see the 12 apostles here, 6 on each side. And Jesus has just said, one of you will betray me. And if scholars have been able to, shall we say who is these various figures. Notice we have linear perspective. It comes virtually perfectly. Down here and here, even the roof as well. And we have the lines almost centered on Christ himself. So this is the focal point that we are using. It draws our attention very well. If we can look over his shoulders, over back here, this is an example of aerial perspective. Not quite as clear in the distant background. Well, you might be asking yourself, what on earth is that? You see, the monks, they want warm meals. And you eat in one place and they cook the meals in another place. And then they decide, well, we got to take the meals all the way around outside. Come back into the cafeteria where you're eating. Well, why don't we just have a hole through the walls? You walk through the door, you don't have to walk around. So they cut this door well right through the bottom of the fresco. Very fortunately, I should say, even though it does destroy some of the painting, the critical figures up here are not damaged by this. Something much more seriously happened in the Second World War. As you know, the United States and its allies, Britain and Poland and some other people, had forces fighting up the Italian peninsula. To get the best advantage against the Germans, using technology, in other words, the Army Air Corps in this example, the United States decided to bomb certain strategic targets, including those in Milan. Many artistic treasures during the war were taken and hidden. They would take these artistic treasures, they would take them and, like the magnificent Gates of Paradise in Milan, not in Milan, in Florence, and they hid them away so they wouldn't be damaged. When the war's over, they bring them back. There's no way you can hide a wall. And even this building was hit, and in that room, 4 walls, 3 of the walls were knocked down. The 4th wall that had the fresco on it survived. So by extremely good fortune, this thing still exists. How about notebooks? Leonardo was he was a sketch fanatic. He really liked sketches. And one of the things he would do is he'd sketch all the time. He had notebooks. He's a little bit of a philosopher. I've known people who used to do these kinds of things. You keep a notebook or a binder someplace, and you have a good thought, you hear a good quote, you write them down. It's a good record. Leonardo did this. Now, Leonardo was left-handed. I've already mentioned that. And I'm right-handed, so I can't relate to this personally. But have you ever noticed a lot of times when people are writing left-handed, they crick their hand, kind of writing like this. And if you write like this, it smears the ink. So there's a problem with that. And left-handed people get pretty good at writing in such a manner in which it doesn't smear the ink. Of course, nowadays when we're writing almost everything on a computer, that problem is not quite the same. But Leonardo's left-handed, and there is ink. So he just gives up writing from left to right. He writes from right to left, so he can write without smearing the ink. Now, the scholars that study him and know Italian, they just simply hold a mirror up to the image and they can read it quite nicely. Well, of all the notebooks he produced, we believe that we have about 1/3 of them. Certainly we would like to have more, but in reality, 1/3's quite a bit. So we can be very pleased with what we do have. He's extremely interested in the human form. Why would this be? Well, if you're going to represent the human form in art, you really have to know what it looks like. Many years ago, at Utah State, I dated an art major for a little while, and she said that, well, during art classes, they bring in models, male and female, not very much clothing, practically none at all, sometimes none at all, so you can see the exact form. So even if you're representing a person wearing clothing, it's a pretty good idea to know what's underneath to represent them accurately. Leonardo took it one step farther. How about looking at what's inside the human form? In other words, he did dissections. To have any example of his dissections. Okay, here we have an idea. You see, he looks at the human skeletal structure. And over here you see this gentleman's muscular structure. Well, where do you get bodies? Well, you hang around hospitals. You and I think of a hospital in this manner. You go to a hospital and you're sick and they shoot you up and they give you some kind of cure and you walk out a healthy woman or healthy man. That's the way we look at them. A lot of times hospitals at this time frame were places where you died. Maybe a little bit more like old folks' homes or rest homes today, where you go in but you don't come out. Well, we have an account by him. It's really quite fascinating. He sees an old man in the hospital. And the Leonardo says, how old are you? He says, I don't know. Well, what do you remember when you were young? What's some of your earliest memories? Oh, yeah, I can remember this. And Leonardo's quite fascinated by this. In fact, in looking back through history, he says, this guy could be 100 years old. That's absolutely remarkable. Leonardo comforts him there, holds his hand. This guy dies this peaceful death. Wow, 100 years old. Leonardo can't wait, pulls out the knife. I got to see what's inside to get a very good idea as to how this man lived so healthy and so well and had such a peaceful death. Now, you and I would consider that to be a little bit strange, and a lot of his contemporaries clearly did think that was strange. But his representations of the human form are quite remarkable and literally quite stunning. He's into, see here you got the muscular structure of the human leg. Looks like a man's leg, the bones. Quite fascinating. Well, let's see if we can get some of his inventions. Okay. He liked to think about machinery. Unfortunately, though these are very clever insights, most of these would not work. He has a representation of flight. Okay, people have been fascinated by flight for a long time. And his time frame, people love to watch birds. Birds are free. Birds can get out. They're free in society. They're wonderful. Wouldn't it be nice if you and I could do that? Get out and fly around. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Well, Leonardo looks at birds. Of course, he gets birds and kills them. Well, they're dead when he gets them. When he gets them, and he looks at the shape of the wings and the structure, and he says, well, what if I just took the same wing strain, the wing configuration, and put it on a human being, somebody can flap his wings, and then we should be able to fly. Well, one of the difficulties in this is that he did not understand the mechanism by which birds actually fly. Yes, of course, the flapping of the wings is a factor, but it's the shape of the wing. You see, in a bird's wing, it's like an airplane. You just simply have the top is, see if I can get this for you here. I need to show you, well, head on. The wing is relatively flat on the bottom, so the air goes across like this. However, the wing on top is somewhat curved like this. So when the bird is in the air, the air goes through here much more smoothly. But when it goes on the top, it sweeps up over. This means that the air molecules are more widely dispersed up here than they are down here. Therefore, this has aspects of a vacuum. Because of this actually, what we call lift in avionics, you simply go up. And this is how modern airplane wings work as well. When the Wright brothers came up with the first powered flight in 1903, they had spent a lot of time in a wind tunnel taking a look at how you get lift by the shape of the wing. Leonardo did not understand this. So even if they had built these kind of contraptions, it would not have worked. He did have a diving bell. Here's his idea of a helicopter. Also would not have worked. He has the idea of a diving bell. You can actually pump air into a man and he'll be underneath the water. He didn't realize that if you go in the water and you have a hose coming down to this guy, the weight of the water will collapse the hose. The weight of the water collapses the hose, no air to the guy. So you're going to have a big problem in that case. The parachute which he draws, you see, we have a parachute. That's about how he did it. Well, in theory, you could have somebody underneath here, and there would be enough resistance from the air that this person could come down fairly slowly without falling and getting killed. Well, he doesn't realize one thing that modern parachutes have to have, and you have to have a hole in this, because you have to have a means by which the air can escape, or the thing will be completely unstable. If you have means, a hole up here by which the air can escape, then you can come down. See, these are very clever instruments, but in reality, they probably would not have worked. You see, drawing them and thinking about them is a very good first step, but in the ability to actually use them as a matter of practicality, you'd have to do more experimentation than he did. Very clever, but this is not the real invention of the parachute or human flight or diving bells or the tank. Well, being a big fan of art, there is a museum in Florence called the Uffizi. Very fortunately, back when I was in my 30s, I did get the opportunity to go there. It was ridiculously cheap to get in. I forget what it was a few dollars. I go, whoa. So you go in, and I tried to understand Renaissance art. Walked into one room, and they had 3 Leonardos there. Bam, bam, bam. I go, whoa, I studied this in art class. Aha. I was as high as a kite. You could have stuck me with a pin and I wouldn't have felt it. I've never understood how people in big cities get on drugs. You couldn't be higher than go to an art museum. It's probably a lot cheaper to get entrance into an art museum than it is to shoot yourself up anyway. There is a Leonardo in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. One of the nice things about going to art museums in Washington, D.C., since they are, here she is, since they are owned by the government, they're free. You got to pay to go to a lot of private museums in other countries, for example, but you can come here for free. Now, very interestingly, she's a little bit like the Mona Lisa. She's not as famous. Notice we do have linear and aerial perspective, very lifelike form. And the first time I went to see her, I must have picked a bad day, holiday. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I went back there to graduate school. And first day I was there, I had to stand in line. Later on, no problem. I got to my heart's content. I came back numerous times to stare at this painting and to bask in its literal brilliance. Notice as it's displayed, it is actually not against the wall. It stands back away from the wall. The reason for this is that there is art on the back of it, not just on the front. Here's a nice painting. You can get an idea of the size of it by comparing the painting with this nice lady right here. And on the back of it, I wish I could get this a little bit bigger. On the back of it, we also see some clever artwork, some plants, and looks like a feather. One time, a Leonardo actually came to Salt Lake City. Not every work attributed to him is actually accepted as authentically by him. One of those in which there are some debate among art historians is the Salvator Mundi, which means Savior of the world. In other words, a portrait of Jesus. And however, there was a man who wrote a book called Civilization, Kenneth Clark, in which he argues that this is authentic. So some historians, some art historians, believe this is actually authentic. It came to the University of Utah. It was a traveling exhibit. My goodness. I mean, I'd like to say I crawl a mile on my knees to see one of these. Actually, I probably wouldn't do that. But in reality, I'm certainly going to go to Salt Lake City. I was teaching a freshman class, art history. It wasn't art history. It was a civilization class. It was a very, very large class over at BYU. Scores and scores of students. Man, I got up there and I gave the pitch. Just go into Salt Lake City. Get yourself a few dollars. Get in the museum. See this. You'll never regret it. Of course, I went and I saw it. I was dazzled. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I came back to my class and I said, okay, let's discuss this a little bit. All those who went to see it, would you raise your hand? Nobody budged. I go, oh, come on, people. Isn't this worth your time? It certainly was worth my time and my dime to go with the University of Utah. And that's probably not it. Looks like it. Any event, to see a Leonardo is certainly worth it. Well, let's talk about another artist at this time frame. Let's talk about Michelangelo. This, once again, is his first name. It is not his full name. Is it Michelangelo Buonarroti? So we just remember him as Michelangelo. Well, he's extremely good in various media. He's extremely good in painting. We'll talk about that in a minute. Particularly frescoes. He's extremely good at architecture. We'll talk about that also in a minute. But sometimes we remember him as a sculptor. And let's look at some of his more impressive and famous pieces of sculpture. Okay. This is the Pietà. Essentially what it means is you bring down Jesus from the cross. The woman here, and she probably plays basketball. She's a pretty good sized lady. She is the Holy Virgin, the Mother of Christ. And this is Jesus himself after he has been crucified and taken down from the cross. And now she's holding the corpse of her son. Quite moving in its theme, no doubt at all. If you look, and I like to look at him a little bit more carefully, see if I can find a larger representation. Probably doesn't work. Can you see his rib cage? Can you see his muscular structure on his stomach? I think he worked out pretty good. You can certainly see his muscular structure on his legs. You can also see the bone structure of his knee and his ankle and his toes and his fingers coming out from stone. One of the areas here that I think is so incredibly brilliant, notice that the hand of the Holy Virgin is essentially around his rib cage. If you look carefully, and I can't show you because I don't see one right here, you can see that her hand is pressed ever so gently into the cloth. And it looks like he's also being pressed slightly into the flesh. See, this is very subtle, but it's absolutely brilliant. In this case, he has Mary dressed very nicely. It's got an awful lot of cloth. Even that is terribly difficult to do well in the medium of marble. I have been to Rome. It is on display at the Vatican. I've been there. I'd like to tell you I've seen it. I've kind of seen it. Let me tell you what had happened. Back in the 1960s, you could actually get access to this. You get fairly close to it. And in doing so, you could touch it if no one's there to stop you. And of course, they don't want you to do that. Well, somebody who was probably mentally challenged grabbed a hammer and he rushed up to the statue. And he went up to the Holy Virgin, went to Mary, and started whacking her on the head with a hammer, saying, "I am Jesus Christ. I am Jesus Christ." We can say what you want to about tourists that are kind of crude and don't really appreciate what they're seeing. Well, tourists came through for us. In fact, I'd like to think they were American tourists, though I'm not sure. They grabbed this guy and pulled him off. Now, there was some damage, not major damage. But the point is this. Now you can't see it. When I was there, they had bulletproof plastic in front of it. You go, yeah, I can kind of see down there. I kind of see it's in there. Unfortunately, if you want to actually see it, you're going to have to see a photograph and get a better idea of it. Let's look at Michelangelo again, another piece of sculpture. Now, there's a whole bunch of these I could show to you. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do so. The reason why I'm saying there's a large number is this man had an incredible desire to create. I mean, the stories about him forgetting to eat lunch because he's in the midst of doing something are really not exaggerated. Morning, noon, well into the evening, work many hours a day. Because of this, his level of work is quite remarkable. His level of work is huge. There are large numbers of sculptures and other artwork that have been presented by Michelangelo. So he and Leonardo are, say, something of a contrast, at least in this factor. Now, I have seen this. You can get close to it. There was no bulletproof plastic when I was there. It's a pretty tall thing. As I recall, you could actually go up. You see it like at ground level, and you could go up, and there was a second story, and you kind of look down on it, so you actually could see it from more than one angle. To say I was impressed with this is to put it mildly. As you know from Bible sources, he lived to be about 120. You can be pretty old guy by that time frame, and you can also have a pretty considerable beard unless you want to trim your beard. And according to the Bible, good Jews do not trim your beard. So he's got a pretty considerable beard right here. If you look at his hand is kind of gracefully placed in his beard. It is remarkable that you can actually take marble, that you can take stone, and make it look like something else. Perhaps more than any other single artist of the Renaissance, we can say that Michelangelo made stone breathe. That's probably a pretty accurate statement. You can't see the hairs on his arms. Michelangelo could not do that. But he can show you hair. Notice once again the muscular structure. You see the veins in his hands. Brilliant piece of work. One of his most famous pieces of sculpture is the David. And maybe I shouldn't even bring it up. You see, let's say one thing about this. That In the classical world, the Greeks and Romans, they like the human form nude. You talk about a lot of ancient sculpture and some frescoes as well. You see representation of the human form in the nude. Now, during the Middle Ages, the church is not terribly into paying for art where the whole Mary Magdalene or somebody's discreetly showing the shoulder. You don't see that kind of thing. But in the Renaissance, throwing back to Roman art forms, it is considered acceptable to represent the human form in the nude, because that's what the Romans did. Well, I really don't want to show you a close version of this because it's kind of embarrassing. However, I've seen the original. It is in Florence. As I recall, it's about 13 feet high. That's a pretty large figure. Well, I know I'm probably never going to get back there again. This is my one opportunity in my life to see this magnificent piece of work. Incidentally, David is King David of the Bible, and I don't think people in the Bible ran around nude. Any event, I'm there, I'm walking around, you see at the front, and it's up on a pedestal, so you're walking around. Maybe I shouldn't admit this. Anyway, I walked around this. I'm going to see the whole thing, right? And usually we see it from the front, so I walk around to look at the back. So I walk around there and I look up and I see this bum. Well, I knew it was a nude figure. What did I expect to see? Look up going, yep, that's what they call it. Quite a stunning piece of work. Let's take a look at the Sistine Chapel. This is in the Vatican. And the Vatican, as you know, is part of Rome. If you're standing back here and looking up at it, and I have been here as well, you look up at it and you can see there's an awful lot going on. To get an idea of actually what he's trying to do, it's very helpful if you would it'd be quite helpful if you can get a little bit closer to it. Now let me tell you what it was like to see it. You're down on the floor, and after a while looking up, you get a kink in your neck. So you bring it down a little bit, look up. And so you have to give yourself a little rest. Unfortunately, it's high enough up, it's hard to get a really good view of it. I wasn't smart enough to bring binoculars, but my eyesight was pretty good at the time. But you can't really see an awful lot of detail. A little bit like the Pietà, to get a good appreciation of it, you really have to see a photograph, because a photograph can bring you a lot closer to it. As you recall, it took something like 4 years for him to do this. Yeah, he's on the scaffolding, and some people say that he was laying on his back so much that he kind of lost his stomach muscles, and when he would get up, his stomach would kind of sag a little bit. He probably was not laying down. The scaffolding is probably standing, but you can imagine the problems with your neck and your arm. But he's really working very, very rapidly on this. Of course, this is paid for by the papacy. The Holy Father, the Pope, comes in, looks up, and sees all these nude figures, and going, I'm painting to what? Kind of, shall we say, Renaissance pornography a little bit. Later on, actually, the church, the Pope, paid money to other artists to come in and paint some clothing over these people, because this is new. Well, some of these things are a lot of fun. This is one of the more famous panels, shall we say. This is God, the Father. It's not Jesus, God the Father. Remember, there's a Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, this case is the Father, and he is creating Adam. This is Adam over here. You can see Adam's kind of getting with the program, he's kind of just waking up. So I guess this touches his creation. Now, it's kind of interesting. His people, a little bit less than robustly thin like his Pietà, or his Moses, or his David. So we say the figures aren't exactly as anatomically correct as we would expect to see them. But we can see muscular structure and bones. Now, notice this figure right here. This is another figure over here. If we were face-to-face in class, I would say, does anybody know who that is? Well, some people might know. That's Eve. I'd like to give you a better picture of Eve. Oh, okay. This is also in the Sistine Chapel. I'd like to creating Adam. Let's go back here. And not as good as we're going to do. If you had a good close look at her, she's kind of going, whoa. Maybe I'm reading more into this than it's there, but she's kind of going. Maybe I should have chosen a different dating website before I hooked up with this guy. She's kind of leaning back a little bit. It's like she's not terribly interested, at least initially, in this man. Well, I call this a little bit playful, a little bit amusing. It certainly is. Let's go back and give you something else here. Sistine Chapel, The Last Judgment. Years later, oh, okay, back to Sydney. I want Last Judgment, folks. Try it again. All right, let's see if we can give you a good representation. Now, as the Sistine Chapel, you look up at the ceiling. I was totally turned around in my directions there. On one of the walls, just beneath the ceiling. As you can see, the ceiling is up here. On one of the walls is the Last Judgment. This is kind of different than what we're seeing. This is the Savior. This is Jesus up here. And notice he looks like a Greek god rather than a Jewish rabbi. Usually as we see him represented in art, he has a beard, does he not? In some representation, he has a forked beard, where the beard comes here and here. Rabbis didn't run around with nothing on the loincloth. I don't know if this was added or not by a later artist to cover up some of the nudity here. But he definitely looks like a Roman piece of art rather than the traditional representation. Let's see if I can get a broader scene. This is essentially the whole thing. Now, your right hand is your good hand, is it not? Your left hand, in fact in Latin it's called sinistra, where we get the term sinister. Your right hand's the good hand, your left hand's the bad hand. So the people that are saved, or will be on his right, on Jesus' right. And the people that are doing, not doing so well are on his left. Let's see if I can get a little closer on this. I'd like to show you some more detail and discuss it a little bit better. And on my success, my luck is running bad. Here we have people being apparently brought up to be saved. Notice everybody's nude. All the cherubs are running around nude. Better shot of Jesus. Can we see this figure right here? I'd like to give you a close-up on that. I'm not doing terribly well on that. The figure right there, and hopefully you can see it a little bit better than I can. There's a person, if you will. It's like he has no bones. It's just his skin. That's a self-portrait of Michelangelo. He's condemning himself to the infernal regions. Whoa, that's quite a statement, isn't it? Some of these are playful. I wish I could show you. I wish I had a little better luck with this. God, this is fun. Now, these are people that are damned. Notice the devil right here. If you get a close-up on him, he looks pretty much like a demon. Kind of got horns. Any event, he's got this club. And it looks like he's swinging a baseball bat or shooting golf. Whack! I'm taking all you guys down to the infernal regions. Can we say this is very important? Here's a better one of him. He's having a great time sending these people down to get their just reward. This is extremely important in setting art. This is pretty important in setting traditions for art, and it's going to be followed by many of the artists for a very lengthy period of time. One thing I should have said about Michelangelo's sculpture before I go on, and that is that he's often considered to be the greatest sculptor of all time. I remember I asked an art professor about that, and he said, well, the greatest sculptors of all time, we usually say are either Michelangelo or the ancient Greeks. Now, we unfortunately don't have the names of a lot of these sculptors, but they were very, very good. There's another sculptor called Bernini, which is a little later time frame. And once again, I'm no art historian, I'm not an art critic. I think that Michelangelo's better. There's one sculpture by Bernini where he actually has a figure grabbing a woman's thigh, and you can see it's pressed in. Well, you normally would think that it would be pressed in, but it looks like she's made out of clay. Just goes in too far. Not quite as accurate representation as we tend to see in Michelangelo. Michelangelo is the architect of the Vatican. What had happened to the head of the church? Well, let's see if we can get an image here. What had happened when the church actually had its seat in Rome during the Roman Empire, and Rome falls, and there's an old church called the Lateran. And this is the head of the church for centuries. Well, we get into the Renaissance, and the Renaissance popes are looking at this thing. It's an old building. The architectural style is not up to date. Let's build another magnificent church, magnificent cathedral to be the head of our church. And they talked to Michelangelo, and Michelangelo is the architect for this. This is an absolutely stunning accomplishment. It's called a basilica. I'd like to get a view from above. This is the main chapel right here. You have colonnades going around, and it's like they're actually, let's get a view from on top if I can. Not working as well as I would like. The colonnade goes around like the arms of Jesus are asking us to come in. Once again, it's a dome. Rome believes in domes. So this is not a medieval Gothic form. This is a Renaissance form. The exterior is brilliantly done. The dome is brilliantly done. The interior is something absolutely incredible. By the time I got to Rome, I'd done a little traveling. And I'd seen the Duomo, for example, in Florence. I'd seen some other important buildings. And at this point, I'm going, well, you're going to knock my socks off. Boy, they sure did. You walk inside, and this thing is absolutely stunning. I remember standing at the high altar. I don't know the dimensions, but it was large. There's hundreds of feet from the entrance to the high altar, and I'm walking up to the high altar. And I'm there taking in the artistic grandeur. It is stunning. And I remember looking to the side of me, and I saw a gentleman, and he was on his knees. Now, he had a small, it wasn't really a pad, it's like a cloth. And he's on his knees, and he was obviously in supplication, in prayer. And he would say something, I couldn't hear what it was. And then he would shuffle, like move his knee up forward a little bit, like a few inches, maybe a foot or so. I move forward, and he would say another prayer. And I looked at him and I look back at the entrance and I go, I probably couldn't have a language in common with him, couldn't ask him what he was doing, didn't want to bother him in any case. But I really wonder if he hadn't started at the front door, maybe even out in the yard, and was praying as he moved forward. Basilica is dome-shaped. I'd like to give you a little bit better view of that. And I'm getting, well, do they call this a cupola? My knowledge of architectural terms is not perfect. Notice we have columns coming up here. Usually when you see columns, they tend to be straight. The artists, whoever these sculptors were, is actually carved these things so it's twisting around. In the middle, of course, there's got to be enough structure, enough stone in the middle to support the entire edifice here. But once again, the artistic accomplishments here are stunning. Now, one of the things I do want to mention about this before we move on is that there's an irony involved in creating the Vatican Basilica. You see, at the time frame when it's actually being constructed is about the time frame we're actually starting the Reformation. Of course, tearing down the old Lateran Church is expensive, but rebuilding this magnificent in just a few decades, this is going to be a monumentally expensive kind of thing to do. Where are you going to get the money to do that? Well, one of the means by which the church, the papacy, decides to get the money is by selling indulgences. And they sell them in places like Germany. And people buy them to escape some of the punishments of sin. And this is the issue that brought out Martin Luther. And when he starts the Protestant Reformation in 1517, one of his first gripes, which he expresses against the church, is that they are selling indulgences. The irony is this: the church, the papacy, wants to create this magnificent structure as the head of the church, as the head administrative building of the church. However, in doing so, they tend to set in motion the Protestant Reformation, which does fracture Christianity. So rather than unity, you actually have division. Stunning piece of work. Well, remember there are two aspects of we often talk about in the Renaissance. This is artistic, which we talked about a little bit about. Now let's talk about literary. Let's talk about the idea of what has happened as far as literature is concerned. And let's mention just a few people. I'm going to mention Machiavelli, one of the more well-known writers at this time frame. Machiavelli lived in Florence. Can we get a portrait of him up here? Okay. He lives in Florence, and he works in government. He's not one of the head honchos in government. He has kind of an administrative post, which is fairly low. Because of politics in Florence and many other places during the Italian Renaissance, we find that various factions in the cities tend to vie for power. And in this case, you do have times when one power base, one group of people, in this case, a important wealthy family called the de Medicis, vie with other factions for power, and the de Medicis push them out and they take over. Well, unfortunately for Machiavelli, very unfortunately for Machiavelli, he's on the wrong side of one of these takeovers. He's a minor functionary for one group. But when the other group takes over, can we say guilt by association? his loyalty can be questioned. He might not really support the new people coming in. Of course, he's going to lose his job. But when they throw him out, they decide to get a little bit of punctuation. In other words, he's tortured. They put him on the rack. The rack is something where you stretch people. It's enormously painful. Well, it's really not enough to kill you, but you can suffer egregiously under this kind of thing. He's thrown out, loses his job, and he's tortured. Now, fortunately for him, he has independent means. He's not destitute. So he retreats to his villa, and for the remainder of his life, he actually has a time to write. And his seminal work, his most important single work, is called The Prince. We believe he wrote this 1517, 1515. He doesn't publish it in his lifetime. In fact, it's not really placed in print until after he dies. Well, almost every aspect of this is controversial. Notice I have right here, The Prince, many controversies. Scholars, political scientists, historians, scholars of various stripes have been debating and discussing the nature of what he was doing and why he was doing it. The Prince is a handbook of what you should do to get and hold power. He calls it the prince because a prince is a kind of person that can get and hold power. Usually you and I think of a prince as somebody who has inherited the power. In other words, your father was the king, your mother was a queen, and therefore you are the prince, and therefore you have the opportunity to inherit your position. Well, Machiavelli doesn't really mean it that way. He's essentially saying, no matter what your birth background is, this is how you get and maintain power in a political structure. It's almost a pitch for immorality. We can say that this is a very good example of the ends justifies the means. In other words, if your ends is power and control of the city, in reality, what you want to do is anything you can to get and hold that power. Do you want to misrepresent yourself? Yes, you do. I mean, do you want to really be honest? No, don't be honest. Tell the people what they want to hear. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to believe in anything, but you should go to church. You should act like, to a certain manner, that you are religious, because this sends a certain message to the people. What you actually are inside is a completely different matter. By implication, he talks about you can cheat, you can lie, you can steal. By implication, you can say you can maybe do some pretty nasty things. You can knock off your enemies. To a certain extent, we can actually say that he's talking about what you and I often associate with the mob. The mob knocks you off, the mob misrepresents you, the mob intimidates you, the mob misrepresents themselves. But is really that how it works politically? See, my problem with Machiavelli is I am a naive optimist. I honestly tend to think that shouldn't we be honest in what we are? Isn't that the best way to be? But he says where do you get with that? Is he actually describing this, however, not the way people like me say it should be, but is he actually describing that's the way it is? It's hard to argue with that. It's very hard to argue with, well, does that ever happen? We are in an election year, as you well know. Politicians of various stripes are making presentations on television, and we read about them in the newspapers and we see them in the news. And are they totally accurate? Are they misrepresenting themselves? Are they acting like something that they are not? All these questions can be very easily asked, particularly in a political year like we're facing. So is he actually having insights into how the system actually works? Well, we can maybe make that argument. In his describing how politics works, is he actually being accurate? Let me tell you a personal story. I was in the Navy Reserves years ago, and there is no Navy base in Utah. And so we get on what we called the airlift. For a while, we would take off from the Air National Guard base by the Salt Lake City Airport. There were other times we would drive up to Hill Field in Ogden, and we would catch the airlift. We took a C-9, a transport craft, fly down to California. And I drilled in Alameda, which is on the Bay Area, and sometimes I would go over to Treasure Island, which is an island in the middle of the bay, and we would drill there. Well, the flight takes, what, an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half maybe. And so you're there, and you kind of end up seating randomly. Of course, you have friends and people you talk to. In one of these cases, I just happened to be sitting next to a woman in our unit. And we're there, and I'm killing time, kind of looking at the walls. She pulls out a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, and she starts reading it. And I go, oh, well, it's a point of conversation. I know something about him. I thought, well, maybe we can have a little discussion, see what she thinks of him, and we can maybe discuss some of the points. So I thought it was a good way to start a conversation. So I asked her what she was reading. She's reading The Prince, and asked her why she was reading it. And that got her going. She was taking a class at Utah State University and a Master of Business Administration. And in this class, she said they were discussing business ethics. And for that class, they required her to read The Prince for a business class. And she just went into it. She said, man, she called it her Bible. This is my Bible. This is the way it is. This is the way you run a business. Whoa. I wouldn't think that, I wouldn't buy a used car from her for the simple reason that if she thinks this is her Bible, then everything you can get away with, any way you can misrepresent yourself, any way you can cheat, lie, and steal would be perfectly acceptable. Now, what I don't know is during the class period, when the professor decided to discuss this issue with his or her students, what his take was on this. But from everything I could say, she was very positive on it. I'm going to say that I didn't handle my end of that conversation well. I was so shocked that I thought she'd condemn it. I was so shocked that I just didn't come up with any point of discussion. Well, let's look at some of the other controversies about it. Did he really believe it? When we talk about the discourses in 1 minute, I will say that there's reason to believe he didn't believe it. Some people say that he wrote it as a satire. This is how those rotten people, the de Medicis, beat me up and got rid of me. So I'm going to satire. I'm going to say, this is, you rats, this is what you're doing. On the other hand, did he write this to ingratiate himself with those people? Look what I know how it functions. You can read this and you will rehire me. Of course, he didn't present it. It wasn't published until after his death, and he didn't use it as a means of applying to get back in. I had a good intellectual friend. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. And we used to have little intellectual discussions. And somehow we got on Machiavelli. And I was being a self-righteous kind of guy. And I was saying, that's kind of a bad idea. And he said, well, you're looking at this too narrowly. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, we live in a real world, don't we? Well, of course we do. And we're very familiar with historical situations, when matters go bad. We have wars, we have genocide, we have people starving in the street. Looking at the photographs of people starving, trying to eat horses and trying to lick grease out of barrels, putting their mouth, trying to live on it. We see starving children. And he looked at me and said, what would you do if you were a political leader to keep that from happening to your people? Would you lie? Would you cheat? Would you forsake honor? Would you misrepresent yourself to keep that from happening? And I said, well, yeah. If that was your clear decision, you would do a lot of things to keep that from happening, including things that are technically immoral. In all fairness to my side of the discussion, however, Machiavelli's not really making that kind of discussion. He's not really saying if you don't do this, bad things happen. One of my difficulties with Machiavelli, even though I don't like a lot of things he's saying, it is very difficult for me to simply dismiss them. Well, let's look at some of the other things he wrote. We remember The Prince. We don't really remember so much other things that he wrote. But let's take a look just for a second at the discourses on Livy. I've read this as well. Well, Livy is an ancient Roman historian, and this is very much within the Renaissance tradition. You're going to write something where you have a discussion, an analysis, if you will, of a Roman historian. That's very much within the framework of the Renaissance. Can we say that the author, being Machiavelli in both cases, but the voice, shall we say, of the Prince and the voice of the discourses are somewhat different. In the Prince, he's talking about doing anything you can for power. The discourses, he's talking a little bit more about fairness in government, about adequate representation, about how you actually have a loyalty in the state, without making all the references to the immorality which we see in the Prince. Can we say, therefore, there's an inherent contradiction here? There probably is. Does the Prince actually represent the same ideas of discourses? I don't think so. Machiavelli also wrote A History of Florence. Very, very good. Contemporary history, what's going on. One of the things he says in the History of Florence is he's very critical of the mercenary system. You see, in the Italian city-states, and cities tend to have a lot of money, and how do they have a military in all their wars? Well, you hire mercenaries. A lot of times these are local mercenaries. A lot of times they're foreign mercenaries. Some of the more famous mercenaries that fight in the Italian Renaissance, in Italy during the Renaissance, shall I say, Sir John Hawkwood, which is an Englishman in the 14th century, coming down as a hired gun. And they're using arrows, not so much guns, but coming down and fighting in Italy. And Machiavelli is very critical of these kinds of things. He says, these men are fighting for money. They're not fighting for you. They're not fighting for loyalty. Will they die for you? He exaggerates, saying that in the battlefields that you simply have professional armies, mercenaries on one side, mercenaries on the other side, and they kind of go through the motions of combat. Well, we can very well document the extent of the slaughter very often in a Renaissance battlefield. So he's incorrect, at least in that sense. But there's another contradiction here as well. He does believe in what we call the militia system. The men who are in your city, and sometimes these guys have other occupations. They're carpenters, they're brick masons, they're butchers, they're blacksmiths. But when there's time to defend the city, if you're being attacked or besieged, these people function as militia, can man your defenses and help protect your city because they have loyalty to the state. They have something invested in defense there. Well, this is also a contradiction, is it not? Because the militia in his History of Florence are people that believe very strongly in having something at stake. While in the Prince, the people are a thing to be manipulated and their loyalty doesn't matter as much. You are young scholars. You've got your entire careers ahead of you. If you want to make a name for yourself, and you will be remembered for many generations, simply write essays, books, whatever, on Machiavelli and his ideas that takes into account all the controversies and resolves them, because it's very hard to do. Well, let's look at some other people as far as literature is concerned. Let's look at some intellectual movements. We're going to talk about the Christian humanists. Actually, early in the Renaissance, we have a group of scholars we call the humanists. Well, who are the humanists? What are they about? Well, they're reacting to a certain extent against the intellectual traditions we see in the Middle Ages. There is a form of argument in the Middle Ages, which we call scholasticism. It's very rigorous. Essentially what you do in scholasticism is you have postulates and counterpostulates, arguments and counter-arguments. Now, let's say you're discussing your issue here, and it can be something, they're very often theological in nature, like what does God think about sin? Does God favor sin, or does God not favor sin? Well, you can kind of guess from the point that where you're going to end up with your conclusion, but this is how you present the arguments. You present the arguments for the postulate. Let's say God does not like sin. That's your postulate. And then you use scripture and logic and essentially this list right here. And this is the argument that's for that. Now let's go to the counter argument that's against that. Can we actually make references? Can we talk a little bit about scripture or something that would make an argument against that? I'm going to say that if we want to be really rigorous in our scholarship, it's not just, it is helpful to go out and make an argument. I'm making an argument on this point, and I will use my evidence to support my postulate, my point. But if you really want to be good at it, you should ask yourself the hard questions. What could you possibly say that's different from my basic assumptions, from my basic thesis? Did I use my, have I accounted for my personal biases? Have I accounted for the weaknesses of my sources? Have I made all the possible attacks I can on my original idea? If you can do that and it will hold up, well, you got a much stronger argument. So you have the basic point of discussion, you have the two sides of the postulates, and you come with a conclusion. Well, I think rigor is very helpful. Could you imagine how hard it would be to make any progress? Can we say under this kind of argumentation, can we say a lot of times your arguments are going to be stilted? Perhaps the most keen argument that the humanists make against this kind of discussion is that they tend to be very narrow as far as theological issues are concerned. The humanists like what we call the free essay. The humanists like to have their basic ideas, and I'm discussing these issues without going through all the bother of trying to attack my ideas. The humanists want to get it right. Remember, in the Renaissance, we want the throwback to the ancient Greeks and Romans. To have that done properly, we do have to understand, do we not, really what these people were saying. Now, well, what do you have in the early Renaissance? Going back to Rome. See, Rome winked out like 1,000 years before. So any book that the Romans had written, many of them don't survive simply because the Christians don't have the time or the resources or the interest into copying them over. Some are destroyed. But if we're going back to something like Machiavelli, Discourses on Livy, should we not have the best copy of Livy available? Yes, we should. Well, this copy, which we might have, is all that's available. Many of our Roman historians, the books do not survive at all. We have lists of, we know names, but we don't have the books. And sometimes when we have Roman historians, we have some of the books and some we do not have. Some we have some of a book, but part of it's missing. Is there any way to fill in the gap? Is there any way to hunt, to go to various places, usually monasteries, which have been, in their scriptoriums, been controlling records for hundreds of years? A lot of these humanists go around and they go to monasteries and knock on doors. Knock, 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 knock. Well, in your archive, what do you have? Well, we got a lot of things. Do you have any books by Roman historians? Oh, I'm not sure. Well, here we have a list of our things. Look at the list and see what's there. And sometimes they actually go in and say, can we look at your boxes where you keep the records? Well, yeah. And sometimes you go in and you can look and find some information, another fragment, another version that was not widely known. The importance I'm trying to make here, get the documents and get them right. So, better essays, freer essays, make sure your sources are correct. By the time we're talking about by 1500, we have a group of people we tend to call the Christian humanists. The Christian humanists are humanists with a flavor. They're moralists. They want to talk about the correct religion. They want to talk about correct conduct. This is how you should act to a certain extent. This is how you become a better person. This is a discussion of ethics. Well, so these people around 1500 are starting to say we need knowledge with the importance of having it make a difference in people's lives. The most famous, the most important, so I get him down here, Christian humanist is Erasmus. And his whole name is Desiderius Erasmus, and you can see the years which he lives. Greatest humanist, most influential. This man is stunningly important as far as the intellectual tradition of Renaissance Europe. Greatest humanist of them all, most important, most influential. I think you can make a good argument of that. And he is very much into Christian humanism. He likes the arguments of what kind of human being do we need to be. This man has enormous abilities. He's a brilliant writer. He has brilliant insights. He knows numerous languages. He spent a long time living in England, so he knew English. He denied it later, knowing German, but he did know German. He knows Italian. His native language is Dutch. He has excellent Latin. He has excellent Greek. And he uses all of his skills to make an important impact. Can we say he dominates letters, essays in virtually all of Western Europe for nearly 2 decades? We only see this really twice in the entire scope of modern history, where we find a writer that is so influential that he dominates what's happened intellectually in Europe for a decade or two. We have Erasmus in this case. So later on in the 18th century, the 1700s, we will make a similar argument about Voltaire. Well, he's down the course. He's down the road in the course for a while. How do I say that he dominates? His essays are very important. People read him and say, whoa, this guy's really good. And other people say, well, let's write things similar. He's so popular, he's so famous, he's so well known that when people have ideas, when intellectuals have ideas, they tend to write to him saying, oh, by the way, Erasmus, I have this idea. What do you think about this idea? And he'll come back and say, wow, that's very good. I like your arguments here. Would you please continue? Or he might say, you have a very good argument, but maybe you could improve it by doing this. Unfortunately, on occasion, you'll say, your argument's not as good. Could you take it in a different direction? If you have that kind of person who's actually passing judgment on much of the intellectual history of his time frame, you can say he's dominating, to a certain extent, the intellectual flavor of that time frame. It's not my purpose to go in and discuss all of his writings. He actually wrote I don't have it here on the list, he wrote an essay about Christian knights, what a Christian knight should be. By this time, knights are largely mercenaries. When I mentioned the mercenaries that Machiavelli is talking about in the wars in Italy, these are largely knights. And Erasmus doesn't really like the military, but he says you can use your force in a very positive manner. It's Erasmus. You can use your power for justice. You can use your power towards good. Obviously, a Christian humanist would make that kind of argument. Perhaps his most famous book is In Praise of Folly, which is first published in 1509. In a course like this, I've already outlined in the introduction to the class what I'm expecting you to accomplish. These books are so important, Machiavelli's The Prince and Praise of Folly by Erasmus, that it'd be very tempting for me to say, oh, by the way, your first book review, I would like you to give me analysis of The Prince or In Praise of Folly. The difficulty with that is they come so early in the course that you're just getting used to what's happening here. And then bingo, bango, first thing I do is say, well, write me an essay. Well, you really have to have a little more time because there's people are going to be adding and dropping the course. So I tried this in the past. It doesn't really work. However, I highly recommend you read The Prince and In Praise of Folly sometime. There is one thing I'd like to couch you about In Praise of Folly. It is helpful if you know more about the time frame. The Prince is more simply written. The Prince, actually, you can read that without having a great understanding of Renaissance Italy. But to read In Praise of Folly, you're probably going to have a big stronger background to make more sense. Now, since I've got a PhD in this area, I think the man is, sometimes he's hilarious. He has very careful insights. Sometimes historians say he uses kindly irony. But see, there is a contradiction, is there not? Praise of folly. Do you really praise folly? Because folly is an error. Folly is bad. So can we say a lot of this is tongue-in-cheek? Oh, there's practical advice here. You know, when you go stay in an inn when you're traveling, wouldn't it be nice if they changed the sheets on your bed before you came in so you don't get anything from the guy who was there before? Good practical kinds of things. He takes shots at the scholastics. He says, oh, these fools. Oh, no, fools. I'm sorry. There I go again. I didn't mean to say fools. I meant to say scholastics. You know, tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of laugh here. His importance is not just entertainment, but in being critical of his society, he criticizes a lot of institutions. He does actually go so far as to criticize the church. The church needs to watch itself a little better. Now, he's not venomous. He doesn't come after and say the church's doctrines are in error. He doesn't do those kinds of things which Martin Luther will do later. But can we say to a certain extent that he is setting the intellectual milieu of getting people to more strongly question what the church is doing, which does have a tendency to influence the Reformation, which is just a few years away. He does have venom in his pen, though. I'm not going to say, because he's relatively nice about how he does it, In Praise of Folly, that he's not going to also hit it pretty hard in some other things. There was a pope that died, Julius II. And he's a good example of a Renaissance secular pope. He's quite a work of art. He uses church funds to make wars. We have what we call nepotism. Technically speaking, these people have no children, at least they have no children from someone they're married to, because according to church law, they cannot be married. But if you have a few nephews or other relatives, and you can give them high church officials and sometimes high secular positions where a lot of money is involved. It's nepotism. You promote your family. Making war, bribing officials. Can we say that he's a little bit more like Machiavelli's The Prince than we would like him to be? Well, a lot of people, including Erasmus, believes that the Pope ought to be much more moral than someone like Julius II. When Julius II dies, Erasmus writes a short play called Julius II, or Julius II Exclusus. In other words, Julius is being excluded from going into heaven. And of course, it's totally farcical. Well, as you know from church teachings, the keeper of the keys, the guardian of the gate that goes into heaven, is Peter, St. Peter. And so he's there. And this is a play where we have Julius walking up to St. Peter saying, "Let me into heaven." And Peter comes back. There's other characters involved, but most of the short play is actually a dialogue between Peter and Julius. And Julius comes to the pearly gates and he says, my keys, my keys don't open this gate. And Peter says, well, that's the key to your money box. Shouldn't you have keys that show you've done good works? And Peter goes on and says, you should do, the Holy Father should do good works. And he said, well, good works, who cares about that? Well, Peter says, have you taught correct doctrine? And Julius says, who cares about that? Let the monks worry about that. I'm more important. I'm making war. I'm bribing officials. And Peter says, have you done good works? He says, well, Julius says, I've had my share of tragedies. I've suffered from the French pox. Well, saying he had syphilis. Now, I don't know if Erasmus is correct on that, but he's making a pretty vicious attack on this man's morality. Finally, in one of the exchanges, Julius said, I wish I had understood this earlier. And Peter says, what would you have done? Declared war? And Julius says to Peter, no, I would have excommunicated you. The Pope excommunicating Peter. You see, one of the weapons that the church would use, very often for political reasons, was to use church power. If someone disagrees with you politically or makes war on you, you excommunicate them. In other words, that unless you do restitution in the church, that can send your soul to the infernal regions. There are times when the interdict is laid on cities and even countries. In the 13th century, High Middle Ages, Pope Innocent III put the interdict on England, which means the soul of everybody in England is lost unless you do restitution. Well, why does he put the interdict on England? Because he doesn't like what King John is doing. So he threatens literally to send all the souls, millions of people in England, maybe 3-4 million people, to the infernal region because as a means of coercing John to doing what Innocent wants. You see, we can see that at times this gets out of hand. And a lot of people look upon this as a papal abuse. Well, essentially at the ending of the discussion, this dialogue between Julius and Peter, Peter says, oh, I can see that so few people can gain admittance into heaven through the pearly gates here when we have people like him that are running church affairs. That is a pretty strong condemnation of what the Pope is doing and by implication what is also happening in the church. Okay. One of the things that he calls Innocent II is the pestis maxima, the greatest pestilence. Okay. We are talking about the humanists wanting to get everything right. I use the humanists in talking about getting Roman sources right, finding pieces of Roman historians that we can use. And with enough effort over many years, there are some more texts or more fragments of texts that are found. But let's look at perhaps the most important of all books in Christendom, and that happens to be the New Testament. Do we want to get that right? Well, of course we do. Of everything, we should make sure it's right. And are we sure? Are we sure it's correct? See, what people are reading is the Vulgate. And the Vulgate has been copied many times. The Vulgate is the Latin version done by St. Jerome in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, back in Roman times. Well, what texts did St. Jerome have? We're not quite sure. Did he have an inferior text? Remember, he's taking the New Testament from Greek. The Old Testament, of course, from Hebrew. But is he using the best texts? Is there any question that maybe something in the Vulgate is either based on inferior texts or are a mistranslation? The best thing we can do is go back to the original Greek language of the New Testament, find the best of all possible texts, and use them to make sure we've got the New Testament right. And there are fragments of the New Testament all over. There's thousands of these. The entire text itself, Erasmus combs Europe and comes up with 10. And I go, whoa, and are all 10 complete texts. Are they all the same? They're not. Well, what do you do if you have one text that says this and one text that says this? How can you make sure that you have the right text? Well, one of the ways you do this is which is older, closer to the source, been copied fewer times. That's one way you do it. Can you logically say, does this fit or does this not? You can do those kinds of things. So textual analysis involved. I have an example for you in Matthew 5:22. See if my memory works correctly. 5. Let's hope I'm not too far wrong in this. Jesus is talking. This is from the New International Version. It's a modern English version. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Now, let's go back and see if we can find the King James Version on that. King James. Okay, now let's read this from the King James Version. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother, the catchphrase is without a cause, shall be in danger of the judgment, without a cause. So I can be angry with him. His dog was over digging up my flower bed. How about this? Some of the earlier versions, perhaps more authentic, is this version. But I tell you, who is angry with his brother or sister. It doesn't say without a cause. You see, that can completely change the doctrinal interpretation of what we have if you have without a cause. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm way out of my league on this. But you can see there's two different texts, and I honestly think that the text that leaves out without a cause is probably more authentic. Now, so what Erasmus does, he brings all this together. He brings all the texts and he collates them and comes up with an authoritative New Testament, where he tries to use higher criticism to make sure that the text is as accurate as possible. Now, he's done that. That is a stunning intellectual accomplishment. But exactly the same time, he does publish, when he publishes, he has the Greek here. He has an elegant Latin translation, which he has made. This is not the Vulgate. An elegant Latin translation, which is on the other side. So scholars that maybe don't have perfect Greek, certainly all scholars have very good Latin. You read the Latin and it helps you understand the Greek. Can we say this is the most authoritative copy of the New Testament that has ever, up to that time I should say, that had ever been devised? A few years later, when Martin Luther decides that he's 1522, that he's going to translate the New Testament from Greek into German, this is the copy he uses. Now he has the best Greek version. And of course, he can check his translation by reading the Latin on the side. And now he can come up with a brilliant translation of the New Testament. So this is a, weapon's the wrong word. This is an ability to use an authoritative New Testament in doctrinal issues. And it's available right at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So the influence of Erasmus is huge. Some scholars have said that Erasmus laid the egg which Luther hatched. I'm going to say you can see some connections here, but I am also going to very strongly argue that there are highly significant reasons to believe that Luther is quite a bit different than Erasmus. But we will now, next lecture, we'll now start talking about the background to the Reformation and get into the Reformation itself. Right now, wherever you are, I hope you're having such a wonderful day. And I hope it continues that way. And we will speak to you again next time. In the meantime, enjoy.